To those of you who've watched any of my content in the past, it's obvious that I'm quite taken with Star Citizen. If you are new here, well, welcome. I'm the guy with the generic gamer tag, and I like to make videos about the development and game design of Star Citizen. If you don't know what Star Citizen is, well, I have a video about that. You should go and watch it after this one. However, Star Citizen obviously isn't the only game I play. Heck, it's not even the only MMO I play. Playing different games and being fascinated with how players interact with systems and the design of the games is one of the reasons I made this channel. Seeing the intent of designers to make something and seeing exactly how the community interacts with said design, it's intriguing to me. Sometimes it goes exactly to plan, and sometimes the chaos of the masses turns a system into something no one expected. I love trying to predict these outcomes and break down the thought processes that lead to certain behaviors in players. A type of gamer psychology, if you will. One of the many advantages Star Citizen has is the wealth of knowledge gleaned from decades of online video games being developed. Being able to see real-world examples of what works, what doesn't work, and most importantly, why. And let's be honest, there's probably no better case study to use for MMOs more than World of Warcraft. If you love it or hate it, it's still been a juggernaut in the industry since its release in 2004. And even today, with tons of complaints about the game's direction, it's still considered one of the most successful MMOs by many. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Generic. World of Warcraft is a high fantasy, cartoony-looking theme park MMO with orcs, goblins, and magic. It is in no way relevant to a space sim-themed first-person MMO. And I would totally understand your thought on that. However, game systems and mechanics are much more interchangeable than you may think. And games don't have to be identical in order to take a lesson away from one to apply it to another. I have played WoW on and off since 2008, and I would in no way claim to be an authority on it. But I have watched it evolve. I've been around for many of its ups and downs and directly interacted with its successes and its many failings. And since the release of World of Warcraft's newest expansion, Midnight, and how well I believe this new expansion is doing, I wanted to take this opportunity to go over some of the things that WoW does well that I think CIG needs to pay attention to, as well as the many pitfalls that the development team at Blizzard has fallen into that it's very important for CIG to avoid. For the sake of this video, I'm going to break it up into 3 areas to cover: world interactivity, community interactivity, and gameplay mechanics. Let's start with the first one of our new list. For world interactivity, I want to focus on 2 things: the lore and the environment. As for lore, WoW has tons of it to fall back on. I personally believe that the abundance of well-written lore was one of the pivotal reasons World of Warcraft had such a successful early adoption. There were 3 amazing games in the Warcraft universe, with expansions on the 3rd making it one of the most beloved RTS series of all time. These games, especially Warcraft 3, had amazing character writing, from the gladiatorial self-liberated slave Thrall to the tragic fall of the champion of the light, Arthas Menethil, or otherwise known as the Lich King. Players of Warcraft saw the molding of the world through the invasion of the orcs on the Dark Portal, and climaxed with the personal stories of heroes of the land of Azeroth, leading to an array of central characters that we came to know and love. Then Blizzard told its fanbase that not only will you have a new Warcraft story to interact with, but it was your own story, fully immersed in the completely realized world of Azeroth, put together as one whole playground as an MMO. Yeah, that made people go feral. To this day, there are people out there who constantly express how they felt the first time they saw that official cinematic for World of Warcraft. A rush of imagination, wonder, adventure coursing through their mind. Truly one of the most influential moments in gaming in general, not just in an MMO. The well-written stories of the world and its characters led people to foam at the mouth for more. These tales told by writers and developers had their fans daydreaming about injecting themselves into this fantastical realm. And then Blizzard delivered just that with World of Warcraft. What I'm trying to say in a roundabout and colorful way is that a solid narrative and lore helped bring people into this new world. Other MMOs have tried to get off the ground in the shadow of World of Warcraft over the years, but many of them failed to truly get a foothold for a few reasons. One of them, in my opinion, is a lack of investment in the world. If you can use prior imagination and emotional investment into a written universe to create the digital world, it tends to get more traction than a brand new IP. From there, gameplay and community support takes the reins. but a game truly needs both to succeed. And also, you can't just try to do what other games do with a new skin. You won't beat World of Warcraft by being an imitation of World of Warcraft, something many developers had to learn in the years following WoW's release in 2004. So, how does this help the development of Star Citizen? Well, whether it's intentional or not, CIG has been kind of setting the stage for their own similar setup. Definitely not as organic, but Star Citizen may be able to capitalize on new players coming from their single-player experience, Squadron 42, and utilize its fanbase similarly to how WoW did with its trilogy of RTS games. Not only that, but CIG's narrative team has been doing tons of world building and lore making. If you aren't aware of it, the lore is actually quite expansive and fairly creative. I would highly suggest you go take a look at Astro Historian here on YouTube and go through his lore videos. I'll admit, I kinda go on a binge once I watch one myself. I will say this though, as good as Blizzard did with the setup, over 20 years can definitely show many failings. And to be honest, learning from failure can be much more useful than learning from success, which unfortunately isn't something Blizzard has been known for doing so well in modern times. Blizzard has had many problems with its later lore, from constantly focusing on payoffs from the earlier Warcraft stories, bringing closure to characters such as the Lich King and Deathwing. They failed to meaningfully inject new engaging characters for the most of their history. Sure, they had a few interesting characters over the years, and the new Big Bad at Midnight is actually a great addition that was slowly built up and done quite well, but it's led to horrible antagonists such as the Jailer. I'm sorry, fellow WoW heads, I know we don't talk about Shadowlands, but it's for science. It is imperative that CIG learns from this mistake. The narrative team needs to constantly be working on new world building and stories that overlap. So if and or when there is a big payoff to a storyline, there's already something established and ready to go so the world doesn't get stale. No one wants the equivalent of, "This guy you never heard of was the big bad all along," or character assassinations to assert that a new character is better, or someone you definitely need to like. I mean, we've all seen an example of that one before. I won't mince words here. Star Citizen has some of the most gorgeous environments out there. Looking over the dunes of Daymar and seeing the gas giant Crusader in your orbit, flying over the landscape of Bloom and admiring the colors of the strange alien world, flying to Delamar and seeing the settlement of Levski tunneled into a massive asteroid. Honestly, I don't think there really is anything else like it out there. Meanwhile, for WoW players, we've been getting breathtaking views such as the fully remade Eversong Woods in Silvermoon City, the reimagined Zulaman, and from the previous expansion, I don't think anyone can forget the magnificent entry into Hallowfall with that giant glowing crystal known as Belladar. WoW has made amazing environments since 2004. Now, I don't think the environments themselves are something that CIG needs to learn from. Obviously, both games have great locations and do it quite well. However, WoW has done one thing with their environments that it is critical that Star Citizen learns not to do. They invalidate their older locations. Every expansion of WoW has had the same problem. They make new zones and the old ones fall by the wayside. In later years, they've tried to utilize the massive empty play space for new content to mixed results, but the reality stands. The majority of the World of Warcraft is empty and barren. Thousands of man-hours, years of development of zones and locations completely abandoned. If you just start playing World of Warcraft, it is likely you will not see half of the created content that 2 decades of developers have toiled away at. And ironically, the Blizzard devs have complained that players may not spend enough time in the new handcrafted zones. And to be fair, CIG is currently doing a decent job at balancing their efforts between the new systems, even if it does feel like Pyro is being left out a bit as of late. But it's only a problem that will become more and more difficult to combat over time if they're not aware of it early on. And there are some worrying signs they might struggle with this due to the fact that older locations and events have broken in newer patches, and they stay that way for quite a while. Keeping systems relevant in one way or another is something that needs to be fully planned out now, making sure that there is always a reason to travel through a new jump point, and always evolving the locations, even if it's a small localized story that changes or evolves over time to keep things new and fresh for the player base. The planned scale of this game can easily allow for a player to travel between all the systems over time, and when they return to a system they haven't been to in a while, find themselves in an entirely different storyline or social landscape. Allowing for players to pick their starting locations is a great start, but breathe new life into that idea by having unique scenarios and/or perks that come along with picking a different location. Maybe something similar to how Cyberpunk 2077 uses its background system when you start, allowing for new and engaging ways for players to start their story, making each system not only unique, but appealing to different players, allowing CIG to more efficiently spread out their community throughout the Empire. I may have used environment as an example here, but in honesty, the real issue is making your own content in the game obsolete. WoW has had a problem with this in more than just environment. Gear, currency, quality of life, and crafted items all become more or less irrelevant after every couple years. Star Citizen won't have the somewhat weak excuse of new expansion to fall back on, making it even more important that they avoid this pitfall of constant development, causing frustrating obsolescence. Community interactivity used to be the bread and butter of World of Warcraft. It was an MMO after all. It encouraged player cooperation through necessity, never really telling you that you couldn't try content by yourself, but you quickly realized that Cave in the Barrens wasn't something you would do on your own. Sure, you could go through the world on your own, doing quests at your own pace, but then you would come to a piece of content that was clearly outside your capabilities. Now, you could just move on. But man, that cave is so cool. What's at the bottom of it? Hey, there's another person walking through here. Maybe we can help each other out. That was the spark of getting solo players out of their shell. Because once you get past that pesky barrier of actually messaging someone in game to help out, all of a sudden you find yourself doing it more and more, finding yourself in dungeon groups full of strangers, joining guilds, toppling raids. In addition to that, the server system that WoW used to have was a limit of the technology at the time, but it led to a community that was much more interwoven than the current World of Warcraft. People knew who you were on a server. Behaving poorly could have consequences, and finding that rare crafting recipe could make you a renowned crafter that everyone knew about. The big issue back then was facilitating these interactions. Players made it work with the chat system, but it wasn't really intuitive and needed a bit more polish. Unfortunately, in what we've come to know as regular Blizzard fashion, they went too far with the quality of life change. Now all you need to do is click a button and you're paired with a group of random people also doing the content that you want to engage with. Sure, it's now super easy. Hell, it'll even automatically teleport you to the dungeon. Isn't that great? But now the dungeons, with the exception of Mythic Plus, are more or less just speedruns with other players you never talk to. You get no interaction. You might as well just be playing with more capable NPCs. Well, sometimes more capable. Yes, I'm looking at you, tank that decides to pull the whole dungeon at once when you know damn well none of us are powerful enough to handle that amount of enemies this early in the expansion and causing a wipe, then blaming the healer. I'm on to you. Bringing me back to Star Citizen, one of the tools that we've been begging CIG to give us for a long time has been the updated social tools. Not because we want to be magically teleported across the system to do the Onyx facilities, or just pop in on Pyro 1 to fight the eradicated Valakar, but because making a group, managing the group, and finding other players who also want to do the content we want to engage with is feeling more and more like the main challenge of the game, leading people to just waiting until fate strikes or their own friends are on to interact with any of the content. And to those who don't have a lot of Star Citizen friends, they just miss a lot of the content because of the chore of finding groups is very circumstantial. These tools need to be implemented to make finding people and organizing groups easier, not making the content easier. It's too late for WoW. I don't think the player base would ever be able to go back to how it used to be. And the ones that prefer that gameplay now play on the still very popular WoW Classic servers. But CIG can make sure they don't condition their players to expect a theme park ride and encourage the adventure. The last thing I'll say about community is something that CIG did very well in 2025. Constant, regular updates and patches. Once a month, we had something new to do. By the time you finished the new content, CIG was already dropping a new location, mission, or event. WoW struggles with content releases, and in circumstances such as when Warlords of Draenor was out, and very severe issues with the garrison system were apparent. Then they sacrificed a whole raid tier to make their better than player housing, followed with one of the longest gaps in new content in their history. Only ended up making Warlords regarded as one of the worst expansions of all time, when in reality, the content that was there wasn't that bad. They over-facilitated players with the garrison system by giving players everything a social hub would give them, replacing the major cities, but then made it very one-dimensional and not as customizable as originally planned. They sacrificed that whole raid tier, one of the things people look forward to the most, and made a player housing iteration that gave none of the satisfaction of actual player housing. Then it took Blizzard well over a whole year to get the next expansion going after the final raid tier of Warlords of Draenor. A year of the same 3 raids, a year of broken community due to a barely customizable but overpowered version of player housing that wasn't player housing, a year of nothing to do in an expansion with less content. Now, anyone who's been around Star Citizen prior to like 2019 can relate to obscene times between updates. But let's be honest, we're well past that now. The community won't stand for that type of stagnancy in patch releases, and no one should. 2025 showed CIG and its player base how imperative constant regular releases are to a live service game, even in an alpha. Meanwhile, Blizzard time gates a lot of their content to facilitate longer gaps between patches due to multiple reasons, some of which are actually totally understandable due to the nature of the game, including leveling and gear progression, giving players with less available time to play a chance to properly engage with the content. Star Citizen does not have these built-in issues, and should constantly be adding new content, new locations, new missions, and new events. Better yet, once the universe starts getting bigger, around 1.0 with 5 or more systems, it would actually be very beneficial to be running more than one type of event at a time to help split the player base throughout multiple systems and ensure server stability. The overall takeaway is this. A huge lesson for CIG to learn from Blizzard is that they cannot get comfortable with long gaps between content updates. You're either going forward or you're falling back. There's no such thing as stagnation. And making quality of life features does not mean you make the content a button click away. There's a difference between facilitating content and robbing the player base from an experience. With the newly released Alpha 4.7 in Star Citizen, we're getting our first look at what crafting in the verse will look like, and that is a perfect example of a gameplay mechanic that Star Citizen can learn from other games. Crafting is a very typical part in many games, from single-player games like Subnautica to other MMOs like Star Wars Galaxies, the latter of which is definitely a huge inspiration for the type of crafting that CIG is trying to go for. But of course, World of Warcraft has also had a crafting system since the very beginning. Now, in WoW, the current crafting system has actually had quite a few facelifts in recent years, and there are quite a few things that can be learned from the problems that Blizzard has had with it, even if the two systems between WoW and Star Citizen are wildly different. The best example of this is with item quality. Materials in Star Citizen can be ranked over a scale of 1,000. That is quite the spread, much more than WoW's previous material quality scale of 3. And with the release of Midnight, Blizzard has lowered that amount to 2. Now, why did Blizzard do this? Well, it's quite simple. Over the course of the expansion, players would be able to easily acquire more and more of the higher grade materials, making lower quality ones eventually less plentiful than the mid-tier, or in some cases, less abundant in the player market than even the high-tier materials. It led to a very weird dynamic in that market, where newer players who didn't want to waste high-quality materials on leveling their crafting ended up having to pay inflated prices for materials that they might not have been able to farm for themselves. Now, you may think that might not be an issue in Star Citizen due to the intended balance of having all types of material quality available in the game, and the only difference is the risk to acquire it instead of a leveled skill to get it, like higher quality and more dangerous zones and lower quality and less dangerous zones, etc. However, the secondary reason for an issue with the lower quality materials actually has a lot to do with player psychology. If you want to craft something special for yourself, it's likely you will want to have the best quality materials you can get and or afford. Now, that balance on how good the average crafted item is directly controlled by the developers with how they set up the whole system. But regardless of how it's balanced, you won't have a mass amount of players making low quality items for themselves or others, especially well after the game's release and a thriving player market comes to fruition. The same desire applies. If you're gonna spend money on a crafted object, you don't want to spend it on something that's just barely better than the stock item, which leads to an abundance of low quality materials not doing anything. And then a shortage of those low quality materials because players will avoid collecting them in favor of medium to high quality materials, then making it harder for new miners or salvagers to really get their foot in the game loop. Sure, there will most likely always be an NPC market for low quality items, but that can only take players so far. What's needed is a designated sink for each type of material, much like a money sink, but in this case, one where the quality of the material is completely irrelevant. This was utilized a little bit in WoW, but not nearly enough, leading to the same issue happening over 2 different expansions and ending up with Blizzard just reducing the amount of types of qualities. Here's what I mean. Right now, ammunition will be created exactly the same regardless of the quality of the materials to make them, as of writing this video. That's exactly what's needed. However, there needs to be a designated sink or even 2 for every type of material. Let's take silicone for example. Let's say that any gun you make can add silicone to the crafting process. The quality of the silicone is completely irrelevant, but if you just add it, the weapon or armor or whatever will have an increased resistance to visual wear and tear. Nothing functional, not something that increases the durability, and nothing that makes the gun more lethal. Just purely a cosmetic change that players will want because if they have a cool skin on their gun, they might not want it worn off in just a few play sessions, leading to a guaranteed use that most players will want a low quality material for, because using a high quality material would honestly be a waste. Every crafting reagent in the game needs to have these sinks to guarantee a market for them, or we will end up having a similar issue to WoW's auction house. Except in Star Citizen, they won't be able to do a new expansion after 1.0 and wipe the slate clean and start all over again. My last and final example really isn't so much a mechanic, but it's my video and I'll classify it as such anyways. That's the new player experience. Both Star Citizen and WoW have struggled with onboarding new players, and it definitely shows. WoW has had this problem for a very long time. A few expansions back, they tried to remedy this by remaking the new player experience and gave us what was called Chromie Time. The new player experience was quite frankly pretty half-baked, and the Chromie Time mechanic was more designed for players making alternate characters and was also half-assed. In reality, these two things should have been intertwined, allowing for new players to pick an expansion they wanted to play in and level up through a carefully crafted Spark Notes version of that expansion. To Blizzard's credit, it does seem like with their revamped new player experience that was released alongside Midnight, that's what they did, just without the choice of the expansion. It leads you through a starting zone and has you go through a trimmed down campaign version of Dragonflight, and leads you through the campaign of the previous expansion, The War Within, ending you just shy of the levels required for Midnight. From there, sending you to Lorewalker Cho, who you gain your last few levels by playing through instances of key lore that's relevant to what's currently going on in the new expansion. Great idea. That's what I had thought they should have done 4 expansions ago. But better late than never, I guess. I will reserve my final thoughts on the system due to the fact that I haven't actually been able to try it out myself, but I definitely plan to in the future. Now let's get into Star Citizen's new player experience, or really lack thereof. There currently only is a small tutorial that you can choose to do when you load in for the first time, and where it does try to cover the big topics, it does feel bare bones at best, and like many things in the alpha, it's quite temperamental. Sometimes there's a good chance you have to be somewhat familiar with the quirks of Star Citizen in order to complete it, due to the buggy mess that it can be, which obviously isn't something a brand new citizen would know to do. In most cases, it's way better just to watch one of the many YouTube videos on how to start, or sign up for a guide on the website. If you didn't know, you can go to the website and request a seasoned player to come and show you the ropes. Honestly, this community is really great. But clearly that's not what should be standard for a game of this technical and mechanical complexity. A well-written and multifaceted tutorial for new and returning players alike is something that is needed. Otherwise, we will find a ton of new accounts made with people quickly abandoning the game due to frustration. Personally, the best way I think they can do this is utilize the in-universe sim pods. If you didn't know, there are currently sim pod assets in-game that are intended to be used for player characters to enter and access things such as Arena Commander and Star Marine. Make a well-written tutorial on general topics, then a few others to cover mining, salvaging, etc. Make them easily accessible in the starting zones. Give the new players a starting mission to get into one, complete the tutorials, and allow them to re-access them at any time. And just on a side note, CIG really needs to redo and add a lot of features to both Wing Commander and Star Marine before the release of Squadron 42. Updating the gameplay and UI, then allowing for players of Squadron to interact with those multiplayer modes would go a long way for its popularity if it's done right. But I digress. Regardless on if you enjoy World of Warcraft and its high fantasy setting, or if you're a die-hard fan of the sci-fi genre only, or like me and has a passion for both, I hope you found this content enjoyable. And I hope that this continues to spread the word that regardless of type or genre, there are lessons to be learned in all types of games while someone's in development. I think CIG gets that, which is why I tend to have faith in their plan. If you are a WoW player and this came across your feed and it sparked your interest in Star Citizen, or if you've been a fan of Star Citizen and been thinking about joining, go ahead and make an account at robertspaceindustriescom and use my referral code on screen and in the description below. That will get you an additional 50,000 credits and give you a good little head start in the verse when you decide to get a starter pack. Thank you so much for watching this video. And if you think I did a good job, it would mean so much to me if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps get my content out there. Once again, I've been the guy with the generic gamer tag, and I'll see you in the next one.